Hey, and welcome to today's episode of How to Start, Grow and Monetize Your Podcast with me, James Burtt, and him, the podpreneur, Alex Chisnall. Today on the podcast, we're talking all about the importance of building out a strong podcast brand. Now, the word brand, it's very overused, isn't it, these days? It's chucked about here, there, and everywhere. But having an important, having a cohesive podcasting brand is super important for the growth of your show, for the professionalism of the thing that you're doing. I don't think I've ever seen a bad looking podcast that's then gone on to explode. I think in a world of making very, very, very quick snap decisions, the quality of someone's artwork, the quality of their YouTube banner, the quality of the assets that come with that podcast says a lot about it. Why would you say in your huge professional experience that a strong brand is important across a podcast?
Because I think it's a representation of you and what you stand for ultimately, and you know that answer of what is a brand, and it's like what people say about you when you're not in the room. Then it needs to embody the values that you stand for. It needs to represent what you're looking to achieve. As a podcast, is it aspirational? Is it inspirational? I mean, what is it? Why do you want people drawn to it? Why are people attracted to it? So I think for me, starting out when you're looking to build your podcast brand, things like that, I think something that we talk about a lot is, what does podcast success look like for you? Get super straight on that to start with. What are you looking to achieve? And then you can start building your brand around that. Again, what values, do you stand for? What are you going to be, talking about in the podcast? What topics are you talking about? What guests you want to have on the show? All of that should really give you an idea as to what this is going to look like. Also, super important, nearly forgot, Johnny.
Oh, God, not again. So, Johnny, what is going to resonate with your ideal listener?
Yeah,
ultimately.
Yeah.
If you've never listened to this podcast before, you get no reference point to Johnny. Johnny is the ideal avatar that I used to have from one of my podcasts, and once Alex drank 17 energy drinks, and then we went down an absolute mental rabbit hole talking about this crazy episode with Johnny. But to you, and I think there's a couple of things to pick up on from what you've said there. When you're building a brand, exactly like you said, your brand is your reputation, nothing more, nothing less. It's the thing that people say about you behind your back when you're not in the room. That's what your brand actually is. So you might see like the Nike tick or the Apple icon on the back of a phone. That's not a brand. That is just a logo.
Correct.
And a brand is the perception that somebody has of you. And you can't control that because it exists in the mind of your consumer, which is a bit fucking lofty and elevated and a bit tricky to get your head around. But ultimately you can, whilst you can't control what someone thinks is your brand. You can curate the experience that they have to make them think the thing that you want them to think about you. And ultimately, there's two sort of schools of thought. If you've already got a brand, if you've already got a business, then you need to bear in mind that your podcast is an extension of that brand.
Yeah.
So it's probably worth including things like the font files and the colors and the kind of imagery that you have and the layout and do you use stock footage or is it of actual people within your team? And is it, it's got to be an extension of that brand. So if I went onto your website or your social media or went on to download a guide from you, would I get the same look and feel? Because that gives you brand consistency and brand continuity. That's really important.
Brand consistency.
So that if you've already got a brand business and if you're a personal brand, then this needs to be an extension of that personal brand. If not, bear in mind that this podcast might be the first step of you curating a personal brand. And this was definitely the experience I had. I launched a podcast in 2017, which was the launch. The podcast was the first thing. And then it launched a coaching business and it launched a YouTube channel and it launched a range of merch and it launched a community. But the podcast was the thing that came first. So
did you have your own scent as well?
No, we nearly had a Gym King range. Honestly, it was so weird. We nearly had dog food. Leave it there. It was so weird.
You would have been feeding me dog food instead of energy
would have
drinks,
been. I would have been. Yeah, that. You wouldn't be going for a chicken brazier down the road. You've been having some pedigree chum. Have some of Burt's pedigree chum. But so the podcast is either an extension of the brand that you've already got, or potentially the first stepping stone of the brand that you are curating. Now, obviously, when we talk about logos, cover, artwork and stuff, that's only one part of a brand, because again, your brand is your reputation, etc., etc. But let's just look at it. We'll, in this episode, dial in on the visual side of it, because that's what I think most people think of a brand as.
Yeah.
When you're looking to look at the design around your brand or around your podcast, one of the key things that I think is really important is to look at the other people that are in your competitive landscape. Now, weirdly, in the podcasting world, you don't really have competitors. Just because someone listens to Screw It, Just Do It doesn't mean they're not going to listen to How to Start, Grow, and Monetize Your Podcast. If someone is a fan of podcasting, like you don't have... Just because you have a listener doesn't mean that I can't have that same listener. It's not competitive in that way. But what I would be looking at is, for example, if there's people in the marketing subsector of podcasting, okay, go into the top 50 or the top 200 charts, if you can find charts these days, now that Chartable is gone, and look at what are the commonalities of those other artworks in those podcasts. And then you make a judgment call. You go, right, do I want to look the same as everybody else, which is not a bad thing, by the way, or do I want to look the exact polar opposite of everybody else? No right, no wrong. It is a decision that ultimately you have to make, but you have to make that decision. So from that artwork, you then also got to think, right, from that, I need to make sure this is going to work as potentially like a YouTube banner or like a LinkedIn banner, or I want it to work for you. Do a really good job of it every time you put out an episode of Screw It, Just Do It. Like your email signature changes to the latest episode, and there's a call to action in that, and there's an email that goes out, and the artwork is in the email, and the video thumbnail is in the email that goes out as well. So you've got to start to think of it in that kind of way. So when you're designing and developing all that stuff out, is it going to work as artwork? Will it work as a YouTube banner? Will it work as a banner on other social media? Will it work as a thumbnail? And also when you're looking at especially the artwork side of things, look at it on a mobile phone. So actually go into one of the podcast
because it's a thumbnail,
and it is tiny, so you won't be able to see if you're listening to this. Obviously, you've got no reference point. I'm looking at the cameras now. If you could zoom in on that editor, like they are tiny. They are tiny, tiny, tiny. So it's got to work really, really hard for you. And you can't have much wording on it. It's got to be very, very minimal. The less you can have on it, the better. But it's got to resonate with the target audience, and it's got to do what it says on the tin. It's got to be like Ron Seal. Does it do what it says on the tin?
That's why we didn't put our names to this in the end, wasn't it?
Yeah, because it just would have been too much. Start going monetize your podcast with Alex Chisnall and James Burtt. You're not going to see it.
Not going to see it.
Final thing that I'd say, like with all this sort of stuff, because if you're a solo creator, you might be going, oh, bloody hell, I haven't got the budget for expensive designers and all that kind of stuff.
Don't need it.
You don't need it. You don't need it anymore. I remember the first time I went to do podcast artwork, I needed a logo and the artwork. I got quoted $10,000.
What?
I know it was like Coca-Cola's branding agency, and obviously this shows how far back it was. The only people that turned up on Google was this one agency. Right. It was 10 grand. But these days, you can go onto AI image creators. They do a relatively good job. You can go onto platforms like a Canva, for example. It does a relatively good job. There's lots of other simple platforms out there. You've got Fiverr. This is a place that I've recommended loads of times. So Fiverr, you can go on and actually get a really, really well-qualified designer who just happens to be in a cheaper geographical location around the world, but they can do the work for you. You're paying someone $10, $15, $20 to do your artwork is a good payday in different parts of the world, and gets you a job done really well. And one of the things I would say, especially with the artwork side of the brand, is that you only get one chance to make a first impression. You only ever get one chance to make a first impression. So you've got to get it right. And the reason I say that is that me and Alex have been involved in a community, and someone who's really is an expert in their field and a super nice guy, and I think will make amazing content, but he was doing some design work and some artwork for himself, and he did it himself, he DIY'd it, and it just looked really poor. With the best will in the world, it looked really poor, didn't it? To the point where me and Al both had to say, Alex doesn't want to say it because he's sitting there, be Mr. Popular. I'll say it because you're too scared to, Chisnall. But in the end, we had to say to him, look, give this as a brief to the designer and let someone go and design it properly. Because sometimes, like, I'm not a good designer.
No,
I happen to have a graphic design wife, which is very useful. But, and the artwork that we create, I never would have come up with that. I think our podcast artwork looks banging. But sometimes you've got to use a professional-ish tools like a Canva. You don't have to spend 10 grand like I was going to do on the first time I ever had to have a logo made. But sometimes it is worth paying someone via Fiverr or via people per hour.
Yeah, there's load
99 Designs is another one.
Yeah,
there's tons out there that will help you to get it right. But again, you can never make a first impression more than once.
So you could, again, and I think you could spend a fortune getting a professional photographer to take photos of you to be the picture that you're going to put on the artwork that's going to represent, the brand of the podcast. But equally, the latest iPhones, the latest smartphones, the cameras in there are phenomenally good.
Yes.
As long
Stand
as
next to a white wall so your designer can cut you off the background.
You just need good lighting, a blank background, and just get someone to take the photos for you and use that as iteration 1. If iteration 2, and what a good point to make perhaps is, once you've done your initial branding for your podcast, it doesn't have to stay like that for the life of your podcast. I'm year 8 now, and we would have had 8 versions of the actual visual representation of my podcast.
Yeah.
So keep iterating. Perfection doesn't exist.
Start now, get perfect later.
All of that kind of stuff.
Awesome. Well, if you have enjoyed this episode, please feel free to let us know. Give us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcast. Give us a follow if you're listening on Apple or Spotify. And if you're on YouTube, please feel free. That's what I was trying to say. Please feel free to subscribe. Or maybe you've got a great hack or a great platform that you've used to make your podcast artwork or your thumbnails or your YouTube banners. Let us know in the comments. We love it when you guys get involved in the conversation on YouTube. And from me and from Alex, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next pod. Ta-da!